Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. We do educational videos and we like to do deep dives into great theories of everything, ancient and modern, primarily obscure things that you can kind of trust for your whole, well-rounded life. Help you with your paradigm shifting, your awakening to 5D consciousness, your formation of a holistic worldview, and your quest for better spiritual, mental, physical health. We are about to do the 30th video on the book called It's After the End of the World. Don't you know that yet? And this is a history of two groups of jazz musicians, so-called, underground, who were attempting in the 1950s and 60s to articulate a new function, a new vocation for jazz musicians, away from the entertainment and artistic kind of archetypal roles to back to a more spiritual keeper of secrets and healer, shaman type of position. And in doing so, they kind of had to deconstruct and reconstruct, and so their story is, pretty all-encompassing. We are in the appendix of this, which is primarily autobiographical, and here we're about to talk about a little bit more about this history class that was taught, and the tree of life was used as what the teacher called the creative historical model. And the class was kind of a trial to see kind of the legitimacy, the reasonability of the very title of the book. It's After the End of the World, Don't You Know That Yet? Which is a kind of a phrase that Sun Ra, the band leader of one of these jazz orchestras, would kind of taunt his audience with. It's after the end of the world, don't you know that yet? And they'd say it over and over and over again. And so this history teacher is trying to see whether it is plausible that the world is actually over. And so we'll start right here. In view of the tree, history continues in a denial phase because people do not know their own history, so they don't understand it does not have to be this way. They cannot imagine another way, because we don't understand how totally our behavior is conditioned by our parents, the people who raised us, or authority figures, and especially the media. We keep participating in a history of hypnosis. Since these trances started when we were children, these conditionings have been memorized and are now practically a part of us. We are addicted to these habits and have been for so long that it is difficult to even imagine another way to live. This is not to mention the fact that these actions, which were once historically harmful, are now norms, such that those behaviors are fully sanctioned and freely rewarded, frequently rewarded by the status quo. In short, we are discussing a negative trance of such duration and ubiquity that it adds up to a twisting of reality. This twisting is characteristic of the ace sphere on the tree, syllogistic, intellectual, rationalizing faculty, In American history and throughout much of the West, the tree's verdict is that this faculty has been permanently twisted and is now facing the opposite direction. It leads to a formula for a dystopic world that is characteristic of the final phase, the final 2 centuries, give or take, of the Piscean age, the age of Pisces. In the 26,000-year cycle of the precession of the equinoxes that all ancient people somehow knew about, even though it's very advanced astronomical knowledge. A lot of that is, if you want to get a wide glimpse of all of the different groups of people, the different mythologies that had the precession of the equinoxes embedded in their mythologies, you can check out the book called Hamlet's Mill from Giorgio di Santayana and Herta von Detjent, which came out in the late 1960s. Those who have used the tree in the past have also reckoned the fate of humanity to be intertwined with the Earth's backward trip around the galaxy, resulting partly in the reverse path of the Earth and the solar system through the zodiac, such that Pisces eventually gives way to the age of Aquarius. The Piscean age came to flowering with Rome and then Jesus, the fisher of men, who is symbolized by the fish, the Piscean fish. Jesus sat within the decadence of Rome. Similarly, this Piscean age begins its end phase in the 19th century, when the modern era began its final push into totally remaking the entire world. Alternatively, these events could also be seen as the culmination of a 5,000 to 6,000 year historical phase where humanity grew out of balance, leaning heavily toward male norms and away from female norms, and then swinging back wildly in a mockery of, deception. The symbolic epicenter of this phase is the Adam and Eve episode, where the world began to be defined by male over female. Gradually, this phase shift solidified in the worship of the blade by the Aryans from the north. The overshadowing of female values was only the first manifestation of the twisting of reality. The acquisitive male values took shape in the violence to women and savages and the poor. By the 19th century, Piscean values had crystallized into absurdity, with few people noticing. This period witnessed a shift from let the seller beware to let the buyer beware. These viewpoints were epitomized by P.T. Barnum and other puffers, and then transformed into the advertiser, whose job it was to convince us to buy something we did not even need just minutes before. This whole system was also fed by the ratification of speculation, the business practices of buying something far away in order to earn a dividend. The government began to reward this type of behavior, to set up laws that historically appeared to be designed to help the small farmer, the poor family, but which were nothing more than high-stakes absentee gambling by the elite who hire henchmen to carry out the injustice. One such example was the Homestead Act of 1862. Another is the twisting of the idea of laissez-faire. The textbooks continue to discuss how this government hands-off approach has been a factor in policy. What is, however, not mentioned is that this policy has never been in use. Government has all along been involved in stepping into policy, but when done for the benefit of corporations and rich speculators, is not called such and is often called public works or public service. And I guess like nonprofits. Laissez-faire is an historical formulation that has no basis in reality, but is only a twisting of clever rationalization. So too the idea of the Supreme Court as justice. The Supreme Court, particularly in 1883, 1885, and 1896, used the sphere's twisting of words in their handling of important constitutional procedures. I think you could probably find that throughout that time period, going back a little further, and even into the legislative body and the amendments that were made at that time too, or just before then. First, it must be recalled that the Supreme Court was never involved, even from its idealistic envisaging, in the issue of justice. The idea of the court was to keep and maintain order. The court was designed to protect those already having rights, not to give any rights to people who did not have them. Since the beginning of the American state, this was rationalized by the people in charge. But it becomes even more egregious in situations that juxtapose the rights of these elites with those who needed rights. The 14th Amendment was ratified in the ashes of the Civil War by legislatures bent on punishing the slave-holding South for their treason. Some of them also wanted black men to have some rights. In particular, equal protection of the law for every so-called person under Southern pressure within the court and without, accompanied by Northern spinelessness and British interference. The 14th Amendment was twisted into a force unacknowledged by most historians. Between 1868 and 1918, it says, 19 14th Amendment cases were decided by the Supreme Court to protect blacks, who during this time were being oppressed heavily. Meanwhile, the 14th Amendment was used almost 300 times, 288 times, to protect the rights of those most vulnerable people, corporations. These events were allowed to transpire because massive resistance stepped in any time that well-represented corporate rights were touched, while a similar resistance in the name of social order stepped in to stop the use of the 14th Amendment for its stated purpose. Justice was only discussed after it was made sure that no powerful coalition had been offended. In the end of the worldview, society is fueled by mind control, pure power, and pure profit, and protected by bleeding heart emotional appeals. The figure that historians and lawmakers want us to have teary-eyed sympathy for is the elite. The elite has been heroic, establishing bastions of freedom and goodness over the oppression of the infidel. More recent history has taught us that some of these people have gone astray. Nonetheless, the general trajectory remains a good thing. Among the ruling groups in the late 19th century America, in fact, there were two primary groups: those who believed in the advancement of big business and funding and protecting technological speculation and entrepreneurship, economics of scale entrepreneurship on one hand, and on the other hand, those who sought to protect the traditional values. Okay, let's go. Okay, let's see. So this is kind of the origin of what he was talking about earlier with the not see, not hear, the two prongs of white supremacy in the early 19th, or in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Nazis were like the business class, and the not here's were like the bleeding hearts. And so before we go any further, we need to determine what is meant by white, where we're talking about the two prongs of white supremacy. There, performing this exercise leads us into another subtle twist of reality, in that we find out that the white race doesn't exist. Before coming to America, people in Europe did not refer to themselves as white. In the US, white was only used by Europeans to define what they were not, that is, black or red. People gained rights in this country by defining themselves or getting the law to define them as not some other color, and therefore white. This was true of blacks as well. This principle also holds when dealing with men. Although I'd have to, with all the questions about pronouns and so on these days, I'm not sure. Those factors were not relevant at the time that this was written, which was 25 to 30 years ago. The reason these categories are wholly significant, historically significant, is because they were historically significant. White and male were contrived by clever rationalizers, dividers before then. Now the contrivance is imitated as if it were axiomatic. All of these different Europeans were all the same thing, white, just as all of those different genders were only two, male and female, and not male, male and not male. Once again, a farcical, almost cynical history lesson when we have the lens to see it for what it really is. However, now they've twisted that around even further and more cynically, to champion the kind of mental illness that makes you think that the genders are on a continuum. And the people that are proposing all of this, the people that are at the top of all this, they know it's not true. And they're using that for, basic chaos in the society, and to basically sabotage many of the institutions in the society. So, this whole thing was written a long time ago, and some of the patterns that are discussed here have been there's a new op, there's a new op that has taken place. These things did happen, but there's another op that's been going around for the last 25 years that kind of overshadows a lot of this, but doesn't negate it, but it makes it worse, and then it also just confuses it. Let's see. In spite of all of these ingredients in the formula for an apocalypse, a watershed occurred around the turn of the 20th century when some of these white male elites began to figure out that this society did not work even for them. Perhaps this realization came with the end of the frontier, and it began to spread. Henry Adams was among the most well-known of these, as he observed that the learned man was beginning to worship power and powerful machines rather than spiritual or cultural pursuits. The new products and new devices created an environment that led to an inauthentic, weightless existence, lacking challenge and purpose. These giant machines, dynamos as Adams called them, awed the elite spectators at World's Fair exhibitions or advertisements and created demand because of economies of scale. Once one was able to manufacture on a very, very large scale, economies of scale would kick in and make the production very cheap. Once you've got your mass production system set up, it does not cost much more to make 20 million widgets than it would cost to make 1 million widgets. As a result, once the factory is built, the bigger the better. Then you want the factory to be operating 24 hours a day, every day, regardless of how much violence that does to a worker's circadian rhythms, etc. The factory becomes a sunk cost, and its well-being, its efficiency overrides the needs of the humans working for that factory. This unfortunate aspect of the factory system, however, was eventually overshadowed by the unfortunate aspects it had on workers abroad. The factory system worked, that is, to produce things, extra things, not needed by Americans. As a result, we have the twin aspects of overseas expansion and domestic advertising to provide for the needs of a mature economy, as some historians straight-facedly called it. The U.S. around 1900 fought to secure an open-door policy in other nations, primarily as a market for excess goods that grew out of our slavery to the dictates of the machine. The open door was only the second phase of a subtle system of transgression called the white man's burden or manifest destiny. The white man's burden theory posited that the other people in the world were so uncivilized and unredeemed that it was the white man's burden to uplift them, to bring them advanced things like Christianity, democracy, civilization, capitalism, reading, writing, modern medicine, modern machines, white rice, white bread, etc. The religious Protestant leaders would first set up a missionary outpost in order to spread their religion to the darker countries on the globe. The mission outposts over the decades would serve as buffers and cushions for the next stage, comprised of speculators and entrepreneurs who now had a base to launch their market operations. Once this happened, the traditional cultures of these lands would become displaced. When the whites got there, the natives had a sustainable economy, producing the things that were needed for survival and a spiritual life. Over time, these natives became subtly enslaved by the market machinery. Most of these market operations were monocultural, or at least oligocultural, involving the production of a single crop or just a few crops of raw material, e.g. sugar and fruit in the Caribbean, rubber and oil and opium in Asia, instead of a balanced economy. The long-term results of such a system were predictable for capitalism. A small percentage of elites from the native land made a killing, and the rest remained poor, but now also dependent upon the wage system for survival and often on the addictive items they were producing. This is another example of violence rendered invisible over space and time through technology, remote violence. Remote violence, however, has seen its most clear manifestation in the violence of military technology. Back in the day, warriors had to fight face-to-face in hand-to-hand combat. Gradually, technology came up with guns which extended the distance from which people could kill each other. They could now do it impersonally. Cannons, submarines, tanks, and bombers extended this process such that the person could not even be sure whether the killing was successful. Nowadays, a handful of high elites can push a button and bring down genocidal violence to their chosen locations. So too, the consumers who don't know their own strength, organized through mass media advertising, can now also bring about oppressive conditions through remote violence without seeing or hearing what is happening at the site of the raw material. If an American company had an opportunity to produce a certain commodity in a distant land because the raw material was plentiful and the labor cheap, then the company, and by extension the government, would argue for the open door, whereby the U.S. companies would be provided the right, exercising their rights as persons, to do business as they pleased. This was also justified as the companies and missionaries claimed that these lesser races had not the capacity to handle their own affairs. As a result, this white man's disease crept over the world. White supremacy found its greatest, but still hard to see, form of propagation in mass production technology, which allowed U.S. companies and governments to act with even more impunity, both home and abroad. At home, this trend reached its most obvious and far-reaching conclusions in the triumvirate of automobiles, motion pictures, including TV, and slightly later fast food. Beginning in roughly the second decade of the 20th century, these industries cemented the idea far beyond its original scope. In 1915, white supremacy was part of the intrinsic matrix of American society. In 1915, for example, the first full-length motion picture, Birth of a Nation, was premiered at the White House under Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat. The film overtly glorified the Reconstruction-era KKK by portraying them as heroes for stopping the blacks from ruining the nation and for saving white women from ruination. The film showed scenes of blacks passing around a whiskey bottle when they were supposed to be presiding over Reconstruction-era legislatures. It showed black men as an ominous threat to white women and the purity of the white race. This propaganda, 3 hours worth of a silent movie, was widely disseminated and certainly contributed to the second rise of the KKK in the 1920s, when membership rose to perhaps 4 million. So yeah, it's important to remember that the KKK was kind of like mainstream in the 1920s, but that this argument is kind of being reflected again here, refracted, I would say, in a different way. But the propaganda again has been twisted, and now these things that they showed, the propaganda that was showed by the motion picture, is kind of like the opposite. That's what is shown now. The group that is being caricatured or portrayed negatively is the other group. And so it's propaganda, but it's kind of like the two wrongs don't make a right. And it's kind of like this idea of equality or equity, so the idea of equity is kind of like, well, we're searching for equality because, or by basically, instead of uplifting the masses to the level, where the elites are, we're just going to push everybody down to this lowest level, and then everybody will be equally screwed. So anyway, it's interesting how, when this was written, this was kind of like radical history, but now it's like it's missing a chapter, and it's also, um, you know, this has been um, contaminated. These narratives were true about certain times and places. Now they're not, but they're still portrayed as being true. And so it's kind of like crying wolf, or complaining about something that is already over. It's already happened. People jump on the bandwagon of things when after the need is already over. So anyway, that's kind of where I'm at with this. But let me know what you think, and we will return tomorrow to talk more about, to pick up right where we are. And if you'd like a copy of this, if you want a copy of the discography for all the different music that was discussed in this book, if you want to send me $1 or more, by in the description there is my what's it called, Venmo and Cash App. Or if you want the whole thing, including the discography, give me $10 and I'll do it. It's mainly the amount of labor that I have to put in to send it to you. 20 clicks and 10 searches I have to do, or whatever. I don't know how many, but all right. Thanks for tuning in today. Have a great day, and hope to see you tomorrow.